All right, welcome everyone. Evening to all those who are joining us near and far. Welcome to another Peaceful Solution Character Education Teacher Certification Training class. We're going to be continuing in the Unit 3, which is the self-control unit. And we're going to be picking up where William left off last class. And this is a very, I would say this is a very powerful chapter within one of the most beneficial units of the Peaceful Solution Character Education program, because when we take a look and consider the characteristics that, we're training our students to develop these positive characteristics, without the character trait of self-control, it will be hard for them to exercise these in any given situation, right? And of course, we've covered previously, and we'll continue to go over many more times throughout this unit and the two to follow. But this requires the action of the student to stop and consider their thoughts, right? The thought process is very important in the decision-making process, okay? But also they have to take into consideration, what is the goal that they're wanting to accomplish. If they don't have goals, if they don't have positive goals, then they kind of leave themselves subject to just kind of doing whatever pops into their mind. The spontaneous choices, the impulsive choices, impulsive actions, and so forth. Not taking into consideration the consequences that can come because they don't think about the things that are going on first and foremost with their thoughts, controlling their thoughts, and then controlling their feelings. And these feelings are very, very powerful. They as we're going to see here as we move forward, as we get started in the lesson this evening, these emotions, right? A lot of very bad decisions have been made merely based on emotions, okay? And that's what we want to try to eliminate. Remember, we're trying to reach a generation of people, even if you're dealing with people who are a little bit older, because they can be students too, someone who might be, already an adult, who might be already in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, it doesn't matter how old they are. Anybody who is capable of learning falls into that category of student. Even us as teachers are continuously being trained, developing our skills, and through repetition and education, we can become more proficient and efficient in the practicing of these positive character traits that we're going over here today. But like I said here, we are in chapter 3, and this chapter here is entitled Controlling. Let me make sure I get you the right title here. But it's entitled Control Your Anger. Okay, control your anger. And if you have your book, of course we've mentioned it plenty of times before on the Facebook official Peaceful Solution page. There's a drop-down menu that you can click more, and it'll bring you to the units that we've covered so far. You have character acceptance was the unit before this one, and we're in self-control, and you can click on that and download that, and you can follow right along with us. But if you turn back to lesson plan 3, and of course the teacher's manual is what we go through because it has all the information, all the tips, the resources, the answers, and so forth to help you to become an effective teacher in bringing forth these lessons to your student. You as a teacher must know the objective. You must know the purpose. You must know the goal. You must have a benchmark to show you if you've accomplished the task of the lesson. If you haven't, then it's necessary as teachers for us to kind of go back and recap. That's why you'll see when we go through classes, we'll go back and we'll do a little bit of a refresher on the previous class so that we can merge it right into the class that we're covering right now. But if you go back to lesson plan 3, page C, and let's look at the purpose and objective there, because this tells us what we're wanting to accomplish with each lesson that we go through. And it says students will learn how to identify, right? How to identify, how to recognize, okay? When you identify something, you're able to recognize it. You're able to pick it out from a crowd. You're able to recognize it from other things, okay? But in dealing with emotions, there are many emotions that a person can experience, and as we've covered before, they fall into two categories: positive or negative. And we covered the fact in the previous chapter, chapter 2, controlling your emotions to your advantage, that even positive emotions must be identified, and we also have to be careful in how we respond to those positive emotions, so that we don't do something to bring a negative consequence into our lives, right? So students will learn how to identify the emotion of anger. Anger is classified as a negative emotion. Now, just because it's classified as a negative emotion doesn't mean that it's a bad thing, okay? Anger just merely tells you that there's something that you don't agree with, okay? Now, the thing where it turns from just an emotion to, something that becomes bad, so to speak, is when we don't control that anger and it turns into rage, right? Rage is the uncontrolled emotion of anger. And that's when people go and they do impulsive things. They retaliate, they attack. And we talked about some of these anger styles that we'll go over again here in this class. And they do things that once it's done, it cannot be undone. Kind of like once you see something, you can't unsee it. So they're going to learn how to identify the emotion of anger and notice how to practice self-control regarding anger. So it's necessary to recognize anger and now put into practice the techniques that we've already gone over from chapter 1 all the way here leading up to chapter 3. And we're going to continue to go on, bring out some more tips and techniques that can be used to develop the skill of self-control regarding anger, so that the student recognizes when they are angry and then they don't allow it to proceed to a situation where it's out of control. They have to be in control of their thoughts, their feelings, and their actions. All right, so we're going to be picking up on page 67, but in order for us to continue with that, because we're going to be talking about picking up where William left off, it's kind of a self-evaluation that we're going to be going over here. And it's determining your anger style. But in order to get that and understand what we're going to be covering here with these questions and this self-evaluation, I want to just take us back just to the previous page. But before we do that, let's just make sure we're on track. Make sure we're on track. And this is recommended to all teachers before you go through any class. Go through the procedure that covers your lesson for that day. And it's beneficial to go through the procedure that follows your lesson, so you can know kind of where your lesson is leading you to bring your students to next. Okay, you kind of have a insight into what's coming. Your students won't, but you'll understand in what you're dealing with or bringing forth or presenting in your lesson, then that class on that particular day, the goal or the purpose of what you're going to be leading up to next, okay? And that kind of helps the lessons to flow together smoothly for your students. But we would have left off on procedure 5, and that's on lesson plan 3, page 3 in your teacher's manual. And it tells us to instruct students to turn to page 64. Now, this would have already been covered in the previous 2 classes. And read the section entitled Anger Sequence. Now, the sequence is a process through which things go through to get to a particular end goal. All right. Have students learn their anger cues and then complete the self-evaluation found on pages 64 through 68. Now, you would have went through part of those self-evaluations from the previous teachers, Chris or William. And then what we're going to do here in this class is we're going to summarize the evaluation on page 69 if we get to that, which I think we should get to that today. So let's turn back over to page 66, because I wanted to review this before we get into determining your anger style, because here is where we're talking about the anger style here on page 66. And if you have your book there, we have kind of a strip there of comic there showing the different styles of anger. You have withdrawal, attack, and displacement. And that's what we're going to cover here today as we go through this. But if you look right underneath that strip there, it says to withdraw, and these are talking about three different styles of anger. To withdraw means to ignore the source of the anger. People who withdraw either pretend that they are not angry or they hold their anger in. They give others what is commonly known as the silent treatment. People who withdraw, notice here, they stew in their anger, right? If you've ever made a stew, on a nice cold winter day, that it takes time, sure, you can make the preparations and cut the vegetables and cube the meat and everything and put the sauce in there and set it in the big stew pot, on the stove or on the fire or however you're going to cook it. And then you'll do that in the morning and you'll let that stew cook all day, right? And what that does is it allows the flavors to come out, right? It allows all the seasoning, to come out into the base. And in regards to eating, it makes for a very delicious and enjoyable meal. But in regards to anger, when something occurs and there is a trigger, right, that triggers the anger, when a person stews in that anger, remember, when you're stewing something, you're cooking something over a hot fire. So now they're entertaining these hot thoughts, okay? And it's bringing up all these other emotions and all these other scenarios and all these other triggers and so forth that has got them looking for a way, right, to not deal with their anger in a positive way, but it's justifying their action of withdrawing, right? It's justifying them giving their friends the silent treatment, okay? So you don't ever want to stew in your anger. Eventually, people who withdraw, notice here, because this is a reason here why you don't want to do it, they reach their breaking point where their anger erupts, causing harm to themselves or others. Kind of like if you've ever used a pressure cooker, right? A pressure cooker has a pressure, I guess it might be a pressure release valve on the lid. And I know there's different types of pressure cookers and so forth out there, but for the most part, you have a pot and you have a little lid that's, I think you can put on some of the older ones different weights on them depending on the type of pressure you want to have in the pan. Well, in a situation where that lid, that release is blocked, right, the pressure is going to continue to build. And this is what you get when you don't deal with your anger in a positive way, when you stew in your anger. And if that continues to build, right, eventually that pressure within that pot, it's going to find a way to get out and it's going to explode, and dealing with pressure cookers, it can be a pretty dangerous thing, right? I mean, I've seen kitchens destroyed as a result of a pressure cooker not functioning properly or the little pressure relief valve not functioning properly, and it destroying a whole stove and cabinets and sometimes even the ceiling and everything. It's the same thing with like a water heater, and you can easily compare these things. And you can use these examples in your class because a water heater takes cold water and it uses an element, if it's an electric, or it uses a flame, if it's gas, and it heats that water to a particular temperature, right? And it has a thermostat, right? It has something that is able to sense the temperature in the pot or in the water heater, and a gas valve that's supposed to regulate, or a thermostat that's supposed to regulate the temperature. Well, if something goes wrong and something gets stuck, well, manufacturers put in a relief, right? A temperature pressure relief. So if the temperature or pressure gets high, that automatically opens up and allows that pressure to relieve out of that water heater, so that water can come out and reduce the temperature and reduce the pressure, right? More cold water comes in and so forth. Well, if something goes wrong, well, just like the crock pot or just like the pressure cooker, that water heater can explode. And an exploding water heater with 50 gallons or 40 gallons of water can pretty much almost decimate an entire house. Well, take that example And you can even, if you get the opportunity to pull some pictures off the internet of a pressure cooker that's exploded, or a water heater that's exploded, or a boiler that's exploded, that would be an excellent visual. And I should have done that this evening. I just kind of thought about that here today, right now. But that would be an excellent visual to show your class that this is how our anger, this is the kind of damage that we can do to other people when we allow ourselves to stew in our anger, right? When we don't find a positive release. Like William was talking about, the psychologist that was saying, when you get angry, don't go and hit people, go and hit your pillow, right? Some people will hit other inanimate objects. You go into some people's rooms and they'll have holes all in their walls because they punched their walls, or they've kicked their walls, or they punched and kicked in doors and things of that nature. They've broken windows, they've broken televisions, or things that their parents or whoever might have purchased them so that they could, have certain things. No, we don't want to release our anger in that way. We want to find positive ways, and that's the goal, because it's not to ignore the anger, right? It's not to release it by doing damage or destruction. Destruction is never the answer, because those little things right there, in destruction, in regards to first it might be a wall, then it might be a door, right? Then it might be somebody's car, an animal, then a person, okay? And it's that mindset that'll lead from one person to a person who goes out and wants to do mass shootings, in their neighborhood, because they don't agree with something. Something's angered them. They used to, it kind of was used in a joking way, and this is, I don't remember exactly what year, but it was a guy that was upset because of some stress and things that were taking place, and I don't remember if he was fired or not, but he was a postal employee, and he came back and he shot up the post office. And then the expression was, don't go postal on me, right? Not don't go mailing me letters, but don't go in here and shoot us up because you don't agree with something that's taking place, okay? And these things are very common occurrences. Well, school shootings, university shootings, people driving through crowds who are at some type of event, or people who go and shoot. You have a lot of these pro-life people who will go and they will actually bomb and murder the abortion doctors and so forth, or people who might be going to get, or who might be supporting abortionists. It's like, they're doing something, right, that's bringing forth harm and death to people who they say are bringing forth harm and death, but at the same time they're pro-life, right? Fighting, adding fuel to a fire, it just creates a bigger fire, and in society that's all that's done. When those type of things occur, you have people who have a mindset of retaliation, right? And they'll find a way to get back or get even with somebody who does something that they consider offensive. Well, this is why we've got to nip this in the bud at a very young age, at the very onset. When you recognize that there's anger, you have to deal with it in a positive manner, okay? So when they reach their breaking point, this can cause this anger to erupt, causing harm to themselves and others. And studies show, as William covered in the previous class, that doing so weakens the immune system and makes the body vulnerable to disease. Now, the other anger style is attack. We're attacking when angry results in physical and verbal abuse, right? You've ever seen somebody, they say that in relationships, one of the first things that is kind of an indicator of future physical abuse is, and it could be from the man or the woman, abuse comes from both sides, is a person kind of, they intend like they're going to, hit or do harm to somebody, but they don't do it. They show that they're kind of practicing. So, you better be glad. You better be glad I'm practicing self-control right now, But eventually, because they haven't gotten this emotion in check, right? They haven't checked their own selves. Something is going to occur, and no, it's not the spouse that caused it or made them angry. No, it's not the person who was driving slow, right, on the road, and they're trying to get to work. They're in a hurry. They didn't get up on time so that they get to work on time. So they, they get out with road rage. No, it's not the person that can't make up their line at the restaurant and they're taking all day and they've only got so much time for lunch, right? No, it's what's going on in their heart and mind that is the causer of them lashing out with this attack, okay? And eventually, this will actually turn to physical contact, physical abuse, right? Because the person has already set it in their mind that it's okay, to deal with this anger through violence, right? But violence doesn't solve problems. Look throughout all the world right now. Just take a look at the news in the world right now. You have many countries right now. You've got problems with Ukraine and Russia, China and Taiwan. Just looking at the news today in Israel. You have a time period where people are supposed to be being peaceful and so forth, and they're at each other's throats, right? Violence. And has any peace come as a result of that violence? No, it just brings more violence. So this is what occurs from when these individual problems or these individual situations lead to the international attacking, right? You see that with nations. It's called war. That's the national response, the international response. When they're angry, they attack, right? They attack. And even if they withdrew for a time period, we just read that eventually they'll reach their breaking point. The diplomats and so forth, leaders call it the red line, right? Don't cross the red line. Well, what is the red line? That's what they're saying is their breaking point. You cross that red line, then I'm not responsible for my actions. You've brought this on yourself, nation such as such, or president such as such, or, ambassador or prime minister such as such, right? Well, had they been taught these things at a very young age and they learned to value them, as leaders of nations, they would be finding ways to peace. I think one of the leaders, I don't know if it was of Japan, maybe it was one of the generals who, during World War I was saying that, a strong man, and I'm probably not quoting this right, and I apologize for that, but he was saying that, a strong man, a strong leader, would be finding a way to avoid war, not go to war. They reward generals and leaders and so forth because they fought a great fight. They fought a good fight. We attacked the enemy. We squashed them underneath our thumb. We made them submit to our demands. A great leader is one who finds a peaceful solution, who finds a way around war, right? And exhaust every effort to make sure that everyone can be taken care of. So now here are some of the things that can occur when this physical abuse takes place. It includes hitting, kicking, slamming objects, or pushing people. Verbal abuse includes yelling, vulgar language, saying cruel things that would put down and hurt the life and well-being of the other person. Now, another type of response involves displacing your anger. So we have withdraw, attack, and now displacing your anger. And this means taking out your anger or frustration on people or inanimate objects that are not directly connected to the incident that you're angry about. For somebody who has totally nothing to do, or something that has absolutely nothing to do with the source of your anger, okay? For example, you're upset with your friend because he didn't invite you to his house. But instead of telling him, now we'll get into this as we move forward in regards to communication, instead of telling him that you felt left out, you yelled at your little brother. You're at your little brother's house. He probably doesn't mind you being there, but this is the displacement. You yelled at your little brother when he tried to talk to you. All three of these responses, withdrawal, attack, and displacement, are examples of anger that is uncontrolled. And that's the key word right there, uncontrolled. What we're learning here in this chapter, the focus, the goal, the purpose is recognizing the emotion of anger and using self-control in regard to anger, right? Uncontrolled anger leads to resentment, hate, and retaliation. So let's look at page 67 now, because now we have a self-evaluation. Now, when when you give this to your students here, you really want to encourage them to be honest with themselves, right? Don't try to tell that, don't give the answer that you think the teacher is going to want to hear, right? We're not going to make you come up in front of the class, and you should not make your students come in front of the class and tell on themselves, right? This is for them to look at these examples and these scenarios and really honestly evaluate their anger style, okay? And all it is to give them a starting point so they can see where they are, so they can know where they need to make improvements, okay? So now it says, when you attack, withdraw, or displace your anger, whether you attack, withdraw, or displace your anger determines what is known as your anger style. Determining how you typically respond. Now this word typically means showing characteristics expected of or popularly associated with a particular person or situation, right? So characteristics that are associated with a particular person or a thing, right? It's typical for John to come in the morning and go straight to the coffee maker, right? He's got to have his coffee in the morning. All right. It's typical at 12 o'clock that everybody checks out and goes to lunch, okay? Or it's typical when you tell, Pete that he didn't do something right, that he flares up in anger, right? So these are things that are expected and associated with a particular person or a thing. So determining how you typically, how you normally or regularly respond when you choose, and that's a key word there, when you choose, if you remind your students back here on page 58 on under facts about anger, the very first point that was covered there is no one ever makes you angry. You choose to become angry. We choose to become angry when anger sets in. Whether you realize it or not, it says here on page 58 of chapter 3 of the same unit, self-control unit here, the same chapter that we're in. Whether you realize it or not, you make a conscious choice to respond to an individual or situation with anger. Anger, like all other emotions, is fueled by your thoughts, and that's why thoughts controlling, recognizing and controlling recognizing the difference between a hot thought and a cool thought, right? Most of the time, cool thoughts are not going to automatically pop in the mind, but if we recognize the hot thought, we can train ourselves to replace it with a cool thought, okay? We can train ourselves, even kind of build up a nice storehouse or a bag of cool thoughts, metaphorically speaking, so that when a hot thought comes up, you can just kind of reach in that bag, pull that out, take that hot thought out, pull that cool, and put that cool thought in its place, right? Put that cool thought in its place so you can start to, change the direction of your emotions, okay? Because you have to change your thoughts in order to change your emotions. So it's anger, like all other emotion, is fueled by your thoughts and how you understand the world around you. Like when people say, this is not fair, right? Well, some people might take two different situations. One say it's not fair. The other says, it's no big deal, right? Because of how they perceive and understand the world around them. They understand that this is how the environment goes. And if you want to accomplish certain things, well, you have to do A, B, and C. A person who doesn't understand that they have to do A, B, and C might just think that the situation is not fair because of their limited understanding. And this is why education is so important, because the more educated you are about a particular topic or even the environment that you're in or how to accomplish your goals, the more power you have to have success or to achieve success in your life and to help others to achieve success as well. If you think negative thoughts that fuel and justify your anger, notice here, then you are making a choice. I'll read that again. If you think negative thoughts, so granted, thoughts enter our mind at the speed of light, and we're not always able to control what comes into our mind right away, but we can control what we choose to focus on and what we choose to let go. All right, so if you choose, if you think negative thoughts that fuel and justify your anger, justify, in other words, make it okay, right? He said this to me. I'm upset with this guy. You know, he is kind of a bully, so there's nothing wrong with me being upset with him. You know, I don't like the way he looked at me anyway. Yeah. I can see why I'm upset. Yeah, you know what? Now I'm gonna hold on to this for the rest of the day, right? Um, so you kind of make it okay. Justification, making it okay in your mind. Then you are making a choice to be angry. All right. So let's go back to page 67 there. So determining how you typically respond when you choose to be angry is also an important aspect of learning how to control your anger. Now let's look here at the instruction right here. It says take the following self-evaluation. Now, we've gone over this before, but just a reminder, an evaluation is the act or the result of evaluating. Well, that makes sense. It's evaluating is the determination of value, nature, character, or quality of someone or something. All right, so when they're self-evaluating, they're determining the value, nature, character, or quality of, in this regard, their anger style. Okay? Their anger style. That's what we're wanting to get them to recognize about themselves in this lesson right here. Okay? Imagine that you are the character in the following scenarios. Circle the answer that best describes how you would respond if in a similar situation. And again, remind your students, hey, look, this is not for you to share with the class. This is not a pass or fail. This is not something I'm going to take and read and judge you based on from the teacher, right? This is something for you. You need to look at this, put yourself in the place of the characters here, and be honest. Be honest in your evaluation. Number 1 there, it says, you ask your friend to borrow his new CD. You might have to say MP3 player. You might have to say headphones. You might have to use something that kind of brings it up to date. With what some children might not even know what a CD is right now. The 2003 CDs were very, very popular. 2022, most of what people get their music from is streaming. Okay, so as a teacher, you have to use a little bit of creativity in that regard. So anyway, you asked your friend to borrow his new CD. He told you no. You reminded him that you let him borrow your CD when it was new. But he told you that he didn't care, right? So now we have A, B, C, D, right? Okay. And as a teacher, this is for you to look at, right? You're determining, or you're seeing here, and they're pretty much all the same order. Attack, displacement, and withdraw. Okay, attack, displacement, and withdraw. So A, this is what the student's going to be looking at and circling. You tell him off and slam the phone in his ear. Now, this is kind of how dated some of the scenarios are in here, because, back in the day when phones were on a wall or on a table, you were able to, boom, slam that phone down. Today, you might have to, and if you don't get it right, you got to kind of press it a couple of times in order to get the phone to hang up. But the person doesn't hear any slamming. You know what I mean? They just hear a disconnection, or the call's not connected anymore. But this is what people did when they were upset and they were talking to somebody on the phone. Then they would just bam, slam that phone down, and sometimes they slam it down so hard you could hear the phone ring, the little bell inside the receiver, not the receiver, the base ring. Not in a cordless phone, obviously, but in the old rotary dial or push button phones. They had little bells in them that when the call came in, it was that loud. That on newer phones, it's called the old school or the old phone ring, right? It's that type ring. That's how phones sounded, before the digital and the cordless and everything else came out. And so sometimes you slam that thing so hard down, it'll make the bell ring a little bit, kind of a resonation. So that's one of the things. You slam it down, phone in his ear. B, you tell him you don't care either, but later yell at your little brother when he asks you to help him with his homework. So now as the teacher, and this is not something we have to necessarily point out at that time with the student, but you keep a mental note that the first example was an example of attack. Okay, you remember it covers not only physical but for verbal abuse as well. All right, he told him off and slammed the phone in his ear. He kind of attacked the phone. The second one there, B, is you yelled at your little brother. Well, this is displacement. Your brother had absolutely nothing to do with your friend not letting you borrow his CD. He just asked for help with his homework from his big brother, right? You yelled at him, okay? That's displacement. Remember, someone who's disconnected or let me see here. Someone who is not directly connected to the incident that you're angry about. And then letter C there, the third response style, you tell him that's fine, right? So he wouldn't let you borrow the CD, so you're on the phone with him, you tell him, that's fine, but we're cold to him, or kind of gave him the cold shoulder for the rest of the week. All right, well, that would be an example of withdrawal. So you not dealing directly with the problem, you're stewing in your anger, and the next time something comes up, right, and maybe he doesn't let you borrow a pen, or possibly he doesn't give you a ride, or whatever the case, then eventually you're going to blow up at him, But as we covered all the way back in the elementary series, kindergarten series, ownership. People have rights of ownership. People have rights regarding their belongings. And they have the right to say no, and no is okay. That doesn't give you the right to be angry with the person because they say no regarding their belongings. In fact, a true friend will never try to force a person to change their mind in regards to their belongings. They'll respect their answer, okay? They'll respect that they have the right to say no regarding their belongings. And then the last letter there, D, you accept this decision and thank him anyway. After all, it's his possession. And like I just said, it takes us all the way back to the very, very, very first kindergarten series, right? Pre-K series even, in regards to ownership. He has the right to make decisions about the things he owns, which means as a student, they would have had to cover this information from the get-go, right? They would have had to have that foundation of recognizing owners. You see how we can't skip over anything in any of these lessons, teachers, because they all tie together. You might not hear about something until you get, hundreds of pages down the road, but it'll tie way back into the very first lesson. And that's why it's important as teachers that we keep these things fresh in our minds. Occasionally go back and rehearse the various topics that have been covered, because they'll tie into, and a thought will pop into your mind about a lesson that was covered, maybe several units ago, okay? That'll help you to better explain and to kind of magnify the purpose of that, or the objective of that lesson in your students' minds, and the goal is really to get them to understand it. And not just understand it, but see the benefit of it. In other words, when they see the benefit of it and they develop a value for it in their mind, then they're going to have the desire within themselves to use those character traits, those skills that they learn, to make right choices. Okay? We want them to make right choices. We want them to have this self-discipline, this self-leadership, right? To make choices that don't bring harm, to themselves, others, or the environment. All right, so that's the first scenario there. Number 2 there. During band practice, you tried hard but kept hitting the wrong note. The conductor became frustrated and told you that it was obvious you weren't trying, so maybe you should stop playing. Now, could you imagine that? You're in band practice, and band consists of a lot of other people there, right? You've got the woodwinds, the brass, the strings, the percussions, Well, you're hitting the wrong note. The conductor's talking to you. The band teacher's talking to you, right? So now what? Everybody's attention is focused on you. Anger wasn't the first emotion in that situation, I bet embarrassment probably was. You go back to those cues, those anger cues that we covered on the previous page there, previous couple pages back on 65 there. I bet a person's face would probably turn like beet red. You're not trying to do it, but here it is. So he tells you, then he kind of, it might be a little bit embarrassing, to kind of call you out like that and say maybe you should just stop playing. Okay. So here's some options. Well, not options. Here's some styles. Remember, these negative things never should be our options, but these are styles of anger. A, you stuff your instrument into the case and walk out of practice, slamming the door as you leave. Yeah, you showed that door who's boss, right? Slam. That used to be a big thing when I was in junior high and elementary. People walking out of the classroom and they would try to slam that door as hard as they could. And we had some pretty big, heavy, schools that were built in the 30s and 40s, 50s, and so forth. They had some pretty heavy-duty craftsmanship to them, and a lot of the rooms had, glass. They were safety glass doors. They had that mesh in between the glass, two pieces of glass. And sometimes students would intentionally try to slam that door in order to break that glass, okay? And this was kind of a sign of protest to show how angry they were with the teacher, that they were asked to leave or something occurred that they didn't like. So B is you tried concentrating harder, but after practice, you kicked the garbage can over when no one was looking, right? C, you pretend that you're playing whenever you can, you pretend that you're playing whenever you came to the note that was difficult, right? And, so you're kind of withdrawing from doing what you need to do. You're not addressing the situation, right? You're not trying to put more, a different effort into correcting it or resolving it. You're just kind of going to step back a little bit. No, that's withdrawal. That's a physical example of withdrawing in regards to, this scenario here. Or D, after class, you tell the conductor that you were trying your best and ask him if he could help you with the notes you're missing. All right, see, that's a right choice. That's a peaceful solution. That's controlling your anger, okay? And keep in mind, in these scenarios, in these responses, it's not saying that the student won't become angry, okay? Remember, anger's not a bad thing. It's how we choose to respond to that anger, that emotion of anger. Number 3, during physical education, one of your PE class, one of your classmates tripped you while you were running. A, you get up and push them, all right? B, you act like it really didn't matter, but after PE, you push one of your peers out of the way while on the way to the water fountain. C, you act like it didn't matter, but you kept thinking about the incident for the rest of the day. Or D, you get up and ask him why he pushed you. He apologized and said he didn't mean to. You say, that's okay, and forget about it, right? All right? In other words, you've dealt, in these D's, I don't want to jump ahead of myself here. All right, scenario 4, your sister said she was too sick to do her chores. Your dad asked you to do your chores and hers as well. Later, you overhear your sister on the phone saying that she got out of doing her chores. You, A, march into her room and yell at her. B, pour bleach on her jeans when no one is looking. C, pretend you didn't hear her, but plan a time when you can get even. Or D, tell your father what you heard your sister say. All right, and then lastly, number 5 there, you ask your classmate to borrow a pen. Now, I don't know if it's the same guy that you asked to borrow his CD, but needless to say, he's your classmate. He said no. Then said to his friend, loud enough for everyone else to hear, some people are just too poor to afford a pen. And I can imagine this scenario like that, considering how children are, how children were, and probably for a time period will be, You know, you probably got some snickers and some chuckles and some laughs and jeers and so forth, right? Again, that doesn't, incite positive feelings within a person who's on the receiving end of that. And so some of these styles here, A, you yell at him, why don't you shut up? B, later on in the day, you see his paper on the floor. Instead of handing it to him, you step on it as you walk by. C, you pretend that his hurtful comment didn't affect you, but you can't stop thinking about how everyone laughed at you, right? There's that stewing in your anger. You continue to bring up a trigger that led to a thought, that led to a feeling, and you kind of like one of those storm systems or a hurricane that kind of moves in and then it just hovers over a particular area, just dumping rain for hours and hours and hours and hours, and then major flooding takes place. Well, what you're doing is you're flooding yourself, your mind, your heart with these negative thoughts, and not to mention the hormones, right, that get flooded into your bloodstream because of what anger incites. The increased adrenaline and so forth, because you go into this fight or flight scenario in your body, right? And you increase these the adrenaline and so forth, and you can crash from that. Usually after that they have adrenaline crashes, and the person is just like they feel completely wiped out, right? And they haven't done anything. They haven't exercised. They haven't run a marathon or anything, but they just kind of that they crash from that adrenaline, from that anger, and now they're just kind of beat. It's amazing how that occurs. And then D there, you calmly state that your pen ran out of ink, then ask your teacher if you can borrow a pen. All right. So in all of these scenarios, we have the attack, displace, withdraw, and controlling the anger. And that's what we're going to look at on page not 69 here, page 69, because this gives us the kind of the answer, the key to the different styles of anger, right? And most people have, remember, as we talked about character in chapter 1 of the character unit 1, a combination of both positive and negative. Well, people are going to have a combination of these different anger styles, okay? Rarely will you find somebody who has all D answers. There might be, but if they're honest, but rarely will that be, okay? So let's look at page 69 under what it all boils down to. Interesting, we use that word boil in regards to anger, right? Because people, emotion can boil over, all right? So how did you do? Well, the letter that you chose most is the anger self-evaluation indicates what your anger style is. So the one you chose most. Not that you don't do any of the other ones, but that's your predominant anger style. Write down the number of times you chose A, and then it gives a little slot there so they can write the number, B, C, and D. And remember, we only have 5, so it's not going to be that many, but it should all equal, 5 at the end of the day. We got to throw a little math in there, Hopefully nobody has like 4 of A and 3 of D. Yeah, that ain't going to work, right? Somebody's not being honest with something. But just have them pay attention there. So let's look at what this explanation is for the A, B, C, D answers. More A answers indicate that your anger style is attack. All right? A person's anger style is attack. Now notice here to the teacher, pay very close attention to this, because this is not just telling you the very same thing that we read here. Okay? What you're going to see in this answer here is two phases, two points. First, you have what the tendency is, the style tendency is, the anger style is, okay? And then the second half of the explanation is the solution. So we're not leaving the student with just, hey, that's your anger style. You're an attacker, right? Or you're a displacer, or you're a withdrawer. No, this is what you have a tendency to do. Now these are some tips that you can use to address it, to fix it, to eliminate it, to control your thoughts and your emotions so that your behavior, your responses will be positive and respectful, both to yourself and others. Remember, in everything we do, we teach. You know, a student doesn't have to be in a position at the front of the room teaching a class. They don't need a master's or a PhD or a bachelor's in education or science or anything like that to be a teacher. Just by your example, you're teaching. So we want to make sure that they're understanding that, and that in everything they do, they lead with a positive example, okay? And that requires self-control. So it says here, when angry, you tend to be verbally and physically aggressive. Your anger literally erupts. All right, think about that pressure cooker, or well, think about eruption. Think about a volcano, right? That's what people mostly associate eruptions with. Volcanoes. You got the grumbling, the earthquake. Or sometimes earthquakes can lead to volcanoes, right? But there's usually telltale signs of a volcano that's getting ready to erupt. There's a lot more activity and lava and steam and so forth. And then eventually, boom, that thing erupts, and it does a lot of damage, especially if it's close to an area where, there's a civilization, there's people living, an island or something like that, either through lava or through heat, or sometimes a sound wave from the eruption, through ash settling and just caking everything with ash and so forth. This is the same thing that takes place with anger, okay? It literally erupts, right? There's no control. You're not controlling a volcano, right? You can't tell the volcano to think positive thoughts so it doesn't erupt and cool down. The cool thoughts volcano, cool thoughts, right? But we can tell ourselves that, all right? We can remind ourselves of these things so that we don't erupt in anger and attack physically or verbally someone else. Now notice here the solution. So you've got the tendency or the style, and now the solution. You need to avoid acting impulsively, right? Acting impulsively is acting without taking into consideration the consequences of your actions. You need to avoid acting impulsively, calm down, and start practicing self-control. So three tips that a person whose style is to attack can use to start to reverse that tendency, that pattern of behavior. So B here, more B answers indicates that your anger style is displaced. All right, your anger style is displaced. When angry, you tend to store. Now remember, when you store something, think about storing up, food or materials or knowledge. Yeah, that's one of the greatest things you used to store up. But you're keeping it or you're accumulating it for future use, okay? And this is this can occur with anger as well. You can store up your anger and the thoughts that feed the anger, and in the future, something's going to come out of you as a result. So when you tend to store your anger and take it out on others, people or animals, or inanimate objects, that's not things that are not alive, as in the manner of like humans and animals, right? Science has proven that pretty much everything's alive, right? And it's not a science class. You don't have to go into debate about it, but just help them to understand that those others would be people, or even animals, or inanimate objects like the example of the trash can or the door or the wall or something like that, right? Something that is not going to respond, to your displacement of your anger. So they take it out on others and inanimate objects rather than handle the feelings in a straightforward way. All right, handling, that is managing. Another word for handle is to manage, right? Manage the feelings in a straightforward way. Now here's the solution. You also, just like an attack, need to control your anger and learn proper communication skills so that you can effectively deal with your feelings. Now, we don't have time to go back to it here, but in the acceptance unit, unit 2 on, let me see here, it was chapter 3, page 44, it deals with interaction and communication, pages 44 and 45, right? And it shows how we communicate, how when we interact with others through our communication, It's not only the words we say, but how we say them, our facial expressions and so forth. They play a huge part in that. So we need to be able to communicate effectively, right? So that you can deal with your feelings. Don't just ignore them and just let them go. No, effectively communicate. Talk to the person or talk to someone so you can deal with those emotions. Letter C there, more C answers indicates that your anger style is to withdraw. You try to ignore your anger, ignoring it, right, rather than deal with your emotions in an appropriate way. Pretending you're not upset or bottling up your anger is not going to make your feelings change. In fact, in the long run, it will only make it worse, right? Ignoring it, kind of like, ignoring brushing your teeth. If you've ever had to travel a long distance and you don't really have a bathroom to go through and, kind of freshen up, or at least your toothbrush isn't packed all the way at the bottom of your suitcase, and that film builds up on your teeth. I can't stand that feeling personally, but it builds up on your teeth. Well, if you ignore it, maybe I'll eat something crunchy. I'll eat something crunchy to kind of shave away that film. No, you're just going to add more film to your teeth, right? And eventually it's going to look like you were just chewing on a stick of butter later on at the end of your trip, right? But ignoring those types of things don't make the feelings go away. It doesn't make the feelings go away. In fact, it can make them worse. Now, here's a solution. Learning to practice self-control and improving your communication skills will enable you to deal with your anger appropriately and effectively. Okay, so the two things, B and C, focus also on communicating. And lastly, more D answers indicate that your anger style is one where you try to handle, again, manage. You can interchange that word handle with the word manage, your feelings appropriately. Well, great job. You are respectful and direct in trying to resolve your anger. In other words, you don't put it off on something else or someone else, or you don't try to deal with it by expressing your anger in these three styles. No, you directly deal with the emotion in a positive way in order to resolve it and to achieve a peaceful solution. And that's the goal we want to always remind our students to come to. A peaceful solution should always be their intention. You already have a basic understanding of how to practice self-control regarding your feelings. All right. So that gives a breakdown of what we built up to from the beginning here of this this chapter, with the anger sequences, the jumping to conclusions, working it out, not fighting it out. Fighting it out is a style of attack. Understanding the sequence of anger, the anger cues, and so forth, and then the styles of anger. All right. So when we pick up with our next class, which is going to be 4/20/2022 at 5:30 Central Standard Time, we're going to start to get into understanding how we need to be responsible, right? How we need to be accountable for controlling our anger. We can't put the blame on someone else or some situation as to why we responded with uncontrolled anger, because that's not positive. That's not demonstrating the positive character trait that we're learning here. Again, we look forward to joining you Wednesday, like I said, 4/20 2022, 4/20, just a few days away from here, 5:30 p.m. Central Standard Time. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next class.